We're just going to start out with prayer. We'll let Andrew light our candle. All right, we're just going to use our imagination.
That's what we do in Intergenerational.
Yeah. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
God, we thank you for gathering us together for this time, for all the experiences that we've had this year practicing intergenerational worship. Be with us in this conversation, guide the thoughts and the questions, and help us to move in the direction that you are leading us. We ask all this in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen.
So, first and foremost, I do want to say that we are not experts in intergenerational worship. We are three folks who have been experimenting with this for less than a year. And while we have read and we have visited and we have been doing this work, but this is just one way to do it. So really our hope is sort of to spark other folks' imaginations about how this work could be done. So I am Sarah Bentley Allred. I'm a senior here at BTS. I've done children and youth ministry in the past and was particularly interested in doing this work and how to include children more fully in worship.
And my name is Andrew Rutledge, and I before coming to seminary, was a nurse for 10 years in labor and delivery, and then transitioned to a hospital setting where I worked in the recovery room. And after I started seminary, realized, and it was one of Dr. Kimball's classes, actually a youth ministry Christian education class, that really sparked my interest in how to train acolytes. And at the time was learning how to start up an acolyte program, and it's kind of sparked from there, and how it's helped me to contribute to this team.
And I'm Elizabeth Henry McKeever. I'm also a senior, and I used to work in communications and fundraising and organizational development. And my interest on this team was really related to how do we navigate change in a faith setting. And I really love to talk about and think about and work with preaching, and so that was my thing. And
so I have the pleasure of talking about the background of Thursday Night Live because one of my many jobs at the seminary is I was a sacristan for the chapel. So I wanted to help behind the scenes work, and each sacristan has a specific day that they're assigned to, and I just happened to be assigned to the Thursday, what used to be called Community Eucharist night, and I just so happened to be there. And at the time, there was a real big push to get children involved in the worship service. This was last year, and the reason for that is there was a big change on campus. Before we started school, before our junior year, 2 years ago, there were no families that lived on campus. There were apartments that were built specifically for families, and once those were built, families with children now live on campus, and they were a new part of the community. And the idea was that we would try to incorporate all ages into this community evening worship service. We found that it was a lovely idea, but there was not really any intentionality behind it. It's like, well, we have children, and so let's put them into a church service. And what could go wrong? And really, through some discernment, the idea was lovely, and we wanted to have some background, or we wanted to be able to
take it further.
And so, since I would just happen to be the person who was heavily involved, just from a logistical standpoint as a sacristan, I was approached and was like, well, what do you think we could do? And I was like, well, I know someone named Sarah who is amazing with youth, and she says, well, I know someone who's really interested in preaching. And so all three of us kind of got together over last summer and really made it our mission to figure out what it means to do intergenerational worship, and what worked well last year, and what were some things that really needed to be tweaked. And so those tweaks were the inspiration for what we have today.
we have spent a lot of time thinking about what is worship for all ages? What does it mean to have intergenerational worship? And we first came up with, so it's not just like multi-generational. It's not just like a bunch of different people of different ages in a room. That we thought real intergenerational worship has some intentionality behind it. And I have done some visiting of various churches around actually the country that are doing intergenerational worship. And one of the priests that I visited with, Miranda Hassett, had this sort of framework from her exploration of intergenerational worship. And she talked about sort of a spectrum of adult-centered worship and child-centered worship. And that with intergenerational worship, she was trying to move towards the middle. And she talked about child-centered worship being perhaps what you might see if you went to a preschool and attended a chapel service at a preschool. Very focused on the child, the developmental needs of that age. Adult-centered worship what was one of our examples from? Might have a lot of silence and not much movement. It might be a lot of stillness and silence and like listening. And so she really kind of helped us think about what is in the middle, and you can move towards the middle in a lot of different ways. And so we found this sort of image really helpful.
And so I'm not sure we said this yet, but the three of us are functioning as coordinators for a service called Thursday Night Live, which is a once weekly Eucharist at 5:15 in Emmanuel Chapel that is a right to Eucharist. So when we're talking about, we're not doing something that's like really outside the box. We're doing pretty much right to straight out of the BCP. But just to give you some context of what this service is, and we will sometimes say or abbreviate it as TNL. So if you hear people saying TNL, this is what we're talking about. And the way that we approach this work, really what you saw at the very beginning is one of the main things that we do. We have approached this service as something that God is calling this community into. We start every meeting, every conversation with prayer. We try to have a candle whenever we can, just as a reminder that this is not about our agendas or our pet projects or our liturgical creativity, but it's really about listening to how God is moving in the midst of this place. So we started really with that framework, that it wasn't about proving how smart we were, how much we could gather this community. Another compelling piece of how we approached this work was understanding and recognizing that for children, especially to develop faith, they needed to be exposed across, not just to their parents, but to people of all different faith stages. And that's true not just for children. For any of us to grow in our faith, we need to be connected with people who are in different stages and different ages of life. And so that really helped us think about getting to the center, not just being like, oh, what do the kids need, but actually how do we create these relationships all across the congregation. And we're deeply committed to the body of Christ and every member having gifts to contribute. And so that was another important framework that we had from the very beginning. The guiding question that we really landed on and we used to really help sort through thinking about what worked well, what isn't working well, is where have you seen the living God? Or what is getting in the way of you experiencing the living God? Rather than, this is what I liked, or I didn't like this, but really trying to focus and frame the conversation of how are you participating in the worship of God? Because sometimes you don't like something, but you experience God in that, and that's really transformative. And then the last piece that really has helped is we spent a lot of time at the beginning of this process setting up some values and talking about what was important. And some of these are listed, like flexibility, intergenerationality, which is the bubble that we talked about, being focused on formation, being stable, so not changing everything every week, but having a consistent pattern, being present, not being perfect, the idea that nothing, not even a liturgical misstep, can separate us from the love of God, sharing the work, and then learning and experimenting. And I want to just tell a quick story about the way in which these values come into play. We had the first service of the year. We've been working all summer to plan it, and it was like 100 degrees. and we were going to have it outside. And some people were expressing concern about that, and Andrew was the first person who heard it, and he said, we need to move it. And I said, no, we can't move it. And then we talked to Sarah, and we said, no, we can't move it. And then we said, wait a minute, what are our values? It's really important that we're responsive, and then we model being responsive. So even though we are in no way prepared to have this service inside, we're going to do it inside because we want to model that. And so that has really helped us work through a whole host of situations, is to stop and say, what value is really at work here, or what set of values, and how can we respond to that rather than that knee-jerk, that's not how I planned it. That's a little bit behind the curtain.
We want to talk about 5 areas of our learnings. We've learned so much. It was kind of hard to bring it all down. And so we're just gonna kind of go through these 5 areas and talk about some of the key things that we've learned. So first, we're gonna talk about leadership considerations. And sort of what we've distilled it down to is be the vision, draw others in. And so some of the things that we have learned is that intergenerational worship is a significant time commitment. And I'm not a clergy person, so I don't know how often this happens, but I would imagine that sometimes it's tempting when planning a service to like look at the bulletin from last year and tweak a couple of things and repeat what you've done in the past. And so what we've realized is that when really being attentive to the community and to a variety of ages, it just takes a lot more work, and that looks different ways. In some of the congregations I've visited, that looks like working really hard on the preaching spending extra time making the preaching really intergenerational, or it may look like spending a lot of extra time on the music to make the music really accessible to various ages. So it can look different in different communities, but it seems to be a significant time commitment. We've also noticed that leadership for an intergenerational service requires a lot of collaboration. And part of that is we want to have a lot of participation, which means that we have to like share the work and do a lot of delegating and training and bringing people along and listening to other folks' ideas instead of just sort of deciding how it's going to go and getting it done ourselves, which would be a lot faster. So part of the time commitment comes from being collaborative and trying to draw more people in. And so one example of that is we've done 2 trainings for youth and children participation in the worship service. Now we have a full campus of seminarians who already know how to serve as an acolyte. But we felt like it was really important to have a diversity of ages and leadership. And so we've spent time working with those folks. And it was both a training session, and Andrew was kind of taking point on this, is there at the beginning of every service to check in with them. And he's also coordinated a shepherding program. So each young person who serves has an adult that is coming to the service and is praying for them and checking in with them. So all of that takes a considerable amount of time. But recently we had a reflection with the young people, and we asked them where they had been experiencing God, and one of the first things they said was acolyting, and that when they participate, they experience God. So there have been fruits from the extra time and work. We've also learned to be okay with imperfection, and wonderful things can still happen even in a service where things didn't necessarily go as planned. And so that's definitely been a learning opportunity for us. Elizabeth talked a little bit about leading from our values. And kind of the last thing that I think that we've learned about leadership is the importance of reflection. This has definitely been one of my key learnings from Thursday Night Live. We have been really intentional about gathering the community together for times of reflection. And generally we'll just gather in a room like this. I think we've done it 3 or 4 times, and we put up some paper on the walls. We ask questions like, where have you seen God during Thursday Night Live? What have you appreciated about Thursday Night Live? What are your concerns? What are the challenges? What are your hopes and dreams? And we let people put out their thoughts, and then we just spend some time talking about them, and we don't tie it up neatly with a bow. We just ask what they've been noticing, and we just kind of let that hang with the community without fixing things. And that actually has made a really huge difference. And I think that people have sort of made meaning out of this service by having that opportunity to talk about it.
One other thing that we did in the space of that reflection session was we actually worked through that bubble model with the group, and that was the time when it really clicked for people. Oh, you're not talking about a family service. You're talking about we had people brainstorm what are examples of things in worship that are really child-centered, and what are things that are really adult-centered, and where's the overlap? And that was the conversation where all of a sudden the 15 people in the room thought, oh, I get it now. And so that wouldn't have happened without that space for reflection.
And a couple of times, folks who have struggled with the service, especially folks with really young children who are like, it's just hard to bring a toddler to worship. They've had an opportunity to share that with the community and really be heard that they are trying their best and that it's difficult to worship with a 2-year-old. And I think that has been really important for them to be heard by the community. So speaking of community, so some of these are like a little bit overlapping. We've worked hard to have people participate as much as possible, and we have done our acolyte training and tried to work with those who are participating in the service as a formation opportunity. So past the nuts and bolts of how do you carry a torch into worship, to thinking about what does it mean to carry the torch into worship? What is the significance of this? And that has definitely made a big impact. And another, well, we're going to talk about that later. Let's see, I touched on reflection. What did we want to say about gratitude? Yes. So something that has been really important in terms of staying in relationship, just like any congregation, this service has had some folks who have struggled with it in one way or another. And really we've found that there's folks that have struggled on both ends of the spectrum. Folks with really young kids who have found it difficult to bring them and occasionally felt like people were looking at them when their kid made noise, or they just didn't necessarily feel welcome. And we have just tried to stay in relationship with those folks, along with folks who are living on campus without their families and found a lot of kid noise to be distracting during worship. And so we've just tried to stay in relationship with those folks, follow up with them outside of worship when needed, write them notes when it seemed appropriate. And at the end of every service, we think about 3 to 5 people that we would like to thank from that day. It could be the preacher, it could be the person that presided, could be somebody that just showed up. And we've made a practice of writing 3 to 5 thank you notes every single week to just share our gratitude for folks participating, and we've heard really good feedback about that.
So the third big learning is our liturgical considerations, and everything you see on this list is underneath that umbrella of the spectrum, the child-centered, adult-centered, and really working towards that bubble, and the values that underpin all of our decisions. So all of these come from those two big umbrella items. So for example, when we talk about familiar language, we've made that commitment that this is going to be a Holy Eucharist, right to, with the understanding that that is the familiar language of the church that exists today overall. There are outliers in that adult-centered, those 8 a.m. right winners, that's what they're familiar with and that's what they connect with spiritually. And, the children's Bible for a child-centered. So again, we're going towards the middle. We've decided that right to is the familiar language of our church that exists today.
In our community.
Exactly, and in our community. And again, thank you for being on. This is specific to our VTS community. And those needs are going to look different in other places. In terms of the length of service, it is a hard stop. Everything that we've read about research is 45 minutes. 45 minutes is the maximum amount of time for people of all ages to be able to fully participate in the service. And that I don't know of any service that we've had this year that has one that went over, and it was like
It was baptism.
the baptism service. and on All Saints Day. So something a little bit extra, but it didn't feel like it was that long because of the different elements that were in this liturgical.
We included movement in that service, so we moved towards the altar for communion in order to kind of get through the extra amount of time with everybody's attention span. But
hard stop, 45 minutes. And Elizabeth will talk later, but preaching is a big part of that. But also, there are certain elements in our Eucharist service that can be cut out. And some of the things that we regularly will decide to cut that take up time are the processional hymn. You can start the service with the open and acclamation, the Lord be with, or
blessed be
God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I'm going to be a priest everyone. You can start with the opening acclamation into the call for purity, and then the song of praise. That's what we use as our processional hymn. It's a really convenient way to cut out 4 to 5 minutes of time. And we, at our service, and this is in conjunction with the norms of the community, is only doing one scripture reading and the gospel, as opposed to doing an Old Testament, New Testament, and gospel lesson, which can considerably cut down on time. We have bulletins that we use that we don't make enough for everyone, because we also utilize, in our space, we have such great technology to utilize the screens, the projection, and with the hope that everything is on the projection that you need to fully participate in the worship service. Well, it was brought to our attention that not all ages are able to recognize and view the screen, so that's why we have bulletins, so parents can help children of age less than 6.
We've heard 8 is about the age in which you can actually read well from like a far distance off of like a board or a screen.
Yeah.
But also, if your eyesight is failing, you might prefer to use the hymnal and the prayer book. So we have page numbers on the bulletin for both ends of the spectrum.
Right. And in terms of the screens, it's environmental. We're going green. You don't have to use as much paper, but also it's a wonderful way to engage parishioners of all ages by the use of different images, especially during those parts, maybe the readings of scripture and during the preaching, that can help keep the attention and something else to focus on. Liturgical space, I think one of the biggest successes in our space is the manual chapel is just so large, and the space that we normally use for the principal service for Holy Eucharist is wider. It's if you recognize, it's the west transept with the big doors. We shifted everything to the north transept. It's a little bit more narrow, and when people sit closer, people tend to worship closer. And that was a big revelation that we had. And leaning into our space, with sound considerations is a very big deal. We're not going to win, so we've tried different things to work with the space.
Music is really a huge part of, there's Anna Marie. Regularly when we ask people, what are you appreciating about Thursday Night Live? Where are you really experiencing God? The music over and over again is what people have to say about it, which I think is a really beautiful illustration of how important music is to our liturgy. So some things that we keep in mind as we think about planning music is, again, to be mindful of attention spans. All of us are tired at the end of the day, but some of us are pushing up against dinner time and bedtime. So we try to pick shorter pieces of music, or if possible, if everyone loves all 5 verses of Amazing Grace, and sometimes we just sing 3 because you still get the same experience. And like for a 6-year-old, 5 verses of a hymn really drags on. We try to pick things that are familiar, and if needed, we'll repeat a piece of music a couple of times. If you have a favorite hymn, you don't have to only sing it once per year. Because you love it, you can sing it more than once. we try to be accessible to non-readers, and what that means is, if possible, picking music that has a refrain or that has a really familiar either call and response or melody, just something that if you're not reading, you can still participate by the third or fourth time through. You know you're going to come back to a familiar set of words. We are repeating multiple weeks, like we said, and balancing. We, Anna Marie, who's, if you're watching, she's back there, but Anna Marie is really gifted at paperless music and music that makes community, and that is music that's sung by heart, that is taught by a music leader. And so we balance music like that. There's, formal pieces of music, but also Tizay is a great example of what most of us recognize as paperless music. And Tizay, it's accompanied with all sorts of beautiful things, but music that doesn't require an organ or piano or guitar. We've been making music without instruments for thousands of years. And then also balancing that with really beloved traditional hymns. We didn't want to create a situation where we only sing what some people think of as children's music, and you never learn the rich hymnody of our tradition. And so balancing what happens in a particular service.
Can I tell one story?
Yeah.
So one evening, Anna Marie led us in the song that has some hand motions: peace before us, peace behind us, peace under our feet. And it was a really beautiful ending song as we were going out. And I did kind of in the back of my head wonder, like, ooh, how do some people take this? Like, it has hand motions. Are there going to be some people who are like not comfortable with hand motions in church? And at our next reflection session, one of our friends from the dorms who doesn't have a family here is a single student. One of the things he shared was how meaningful that song was, and how you doing the hand motions felt so authentic and very embodied, and that was like a really meaningful moment for him in worship. And so, yeah.
Typically, what's good for one group is generally always good for all groups. So that's kind of
a lot of times, yeah.
Yeah, a lot of times that's spectrum.
Yeah, so that was really cool.
The other just final note on music is we have a lot of great singers in this community, and we sometimes try to pick music that's really easy to harmonize so that you can just add that texture. I mean, we've been ending recently communion with eat this bread, drink this cup, and it just has these beautiful harmonies that can layer on top of each other and just creates that richness of the whole community singing together. And then preaching is our next topic. And speak to the whole room is kind of the phrase that we used to sum this up. Something that we had seen happen in the past is because there were kids in the room, preachers would say, all right, now you kids, and would kind of turn to the children and completely cut off everyone else in the room. And there are models of doing children's sermons that really work, but what we were trying to do is to have children be engaged in the sermon without no one else being engaged. The other thing that was really important, I think, in our thinking around preaching was also to let preachers off the hook. Like, your whole sermon does not need to speak to every single person in the room. And so we said you don't need to have something, the whole thing doesn't need to be for everyone, but there needs to be a little piece for everyone. And so that might mean telling a story, using a really compelling image. We've had some sermons about a rope. Jesus is on one end of the rope and we're on the other end of the rope. Or superheroes. The disciples are like superheroes. They are working together, but there's a power beyond them at work. And just these images that sort of cut across all generations. Anyone knows what a rope is and can think about that. And there's going to be layers of theological meaning on top of that, but you can still think, okay, there was, a sermon about a rope.
I still think of Lisa's the float trip.
Yeah.
And how I can tell you exactly what that sermon was, because she had it projected an image of the float trip, and I'm like, oh, it just speaking directly to what is the image, but it's also projected, and thinking back, oh yeah, I remember the image and I knew what that sermon was exactly about.
Yeah, and so images can be verbal, they can be actual visual images, and we also have encouraged preachers to talk about emotions. We were for All Saints Day, the preacher wanted to preach about grief and loss and said, but I don't know, this might be like too much for a kid. And I said, every single child in this community has left a community to come here. Most children have lost a pet or if not a loved one. So children know about grief and can talk about grief. And we can talk about some ways to make it age appropriate. But if you say that, a 9-year-old will know what you're talking about. And so really working with preachers to think about this. Now, this is a place where the seminary is different than a lot of worshiping communities because we have a different preacher every single week. If you're working with 2 preachers or 3 preachers or 4 preachers, you wouldn't necessarily have the conversation every single week. But what I really love about making this space is people can say, well, I hadn't thought about using any images. What do you think might work? And then all of a sudden we're in a conversation together about the word and about the lessons and about how that text can come alive, which I think just makes for richer. I want to do that every time I preach, whether I'm preaching to an intergenerational audience or not. And so it really has just added a layer of discernment and listening and prayer into the preparation process. And every person I've met with, or someone on the team has met with every preacher before they've preached, and they have really appreciated. A lot of times we think of this idea of you're writing sermons alone in your study, but that doesn't have to be the way that preaching happens. We talked a little bit about the technology, and that's something we have in this space that isn't in every space, but it's been really effective and not as cheesy as I thought people would think it was. It all depends on how you use it. You don't want like word art zooming in. But like my 2-year-old, when Lisa was preaching about the float trip, there was an image of a water, and he's not listening to the sermon, but he said water, and there's 4 screens. He said water, 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 water. He knew we were talking about water. And then obviously a 2-year-old is one thing, but I like to tell people, think about a 9-year-old. Like picture a specific 9-year-old, not just any 9-year-old, but think about Raymond is the example I always, he's not 9 anymore, but he, and think like, so not in the abstract, but think about a person and how are they experiencing this message, and think about people in different age groups. And rather than this being an abstract congregation, think about the particular people in the congregation. And then, when possible, to focus on one takeaway. A lot of times, I think we try to cram 4 or 5 points into a sermon, and we can just have 1 point that's really strong. That's great. And then length, I left it till the end because it can be easy to get hung up on length. But really, I think if you're delivering 1 point solidly, 5 to 7 minutes is really the right amount of time. That's shorter than a lot of people are used to preaching. But it forces you to kind of get to the point and to speak compellingly in a simple and clear way, which is, I think, what preachers ought to be doing. So that's my preaching soapbox. Yes.
All right. So we would love to take questions about any of these things that we've talked about, or hear other thoughts and experiences. Yeah.
So I just thought it was interesting. On one hand, you talked about ways that you could shorten the length of the service, and then you talk about how important the music is.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you kind of wrap yourselves around that and reconcile those kind of competing interests?
Yeah, I don't know how we got, I think one of the places the way we talked, preaching was like the obvious place to focus on being tighter. Like, I don't know. I don't have a good answer.
I think.
I think it goes back to what we were talking about, the importance of, we talked about the significant time commitment. There's a lot of thoughtfulness that's put into which songs we're singing and when, because we often do cut out a whole song in the service to cut down the length, but the songs that were chosen, do we have a published song that is going to speak to the message of what's being talked about in that day? And they're just not songs that we've used in the past. It's the the intentionality behind what we're using, I think, matters.
Anna Marie actually has done a lot of the music picking and selection for us. Do you have any comment on that? I will say the paperless music pieces are generally shorter, and we generally use multiple pieces in a service. What other thoughts do you have?
We do, when we do sing a familiar hymn, and we do want to be exposing young people to the tunes and words of familiar hymns, but we really only need 3 verses to come in and out. And because we're using projection, we can make that adjustment, and we don't have to. I mean, I think it's fine to make announcements to the congregation, but we don't have to say, we're going to sing verses 1, 5, 7, and 12. We can just project what we want. And if we need a little more music, you just flip the slide back and nudge the pianist.
Yep.
So.
Which we've done. Under the direction of Anna Marie. Thank you.
I think another thing that sort of relates to that is, as we really early on, we were thinking about everyone has gifts to offer, and music is a great way that all people can offer their gifts that doesn't necessarily prioritize one form of leadership. And so I think that's why music became really important. Is it was a way that we were all in it together. I think that's why that piece has held, even when other pieces we've had a little bit more flexibility with.
Yeah.
I noticed in the slide, you have the kids out of their seats, close up to the altar. But I assume the adults are still back in their seats. Is that right? Am I reading that right?
In this picture?
Yeah.
This is an anomaly.
Oh,
This is not how it has happened in the
Okay.
past. They're doing motions, and so the children are actually up leading the final song with Anna Marie. They've kind of come forward.
okay. Then they're leading it for the whole
Mhm.
congregation. Okay.
Although it is interesting, we found that a lot of times who fills the front row is like elementary schoolers. And that has been a really interesting, and like we've watched them during the I watched them during the sermons, and they are like leaning in and like having a dialogue with the preacher. It's really interesting.
And I think a big part of that is because that's where acolytes normally sit. So even if they're not acolyting, they still like to sit on the front row and still feel like they're part of the friends.
And they actually, during our recent reflection session, I don't know if you remember this, that they mentioned that tall people should sit in the back. That was one of the suggestions that they made to us, is that how do you experience God? When you can see. And that means that tall people should sit in the back. Yeah. Other questions?
Just to circle
Yeah.
back, we pick music that is singable by everyone in the room. So it doesn't matter how beautifully the text goes with the readings. If it's not easy for people to sing, then we don't sing it. Because again, it's supporting everyone's participation.
And even one of our values is stability, but there have been times where we would like to have the same sanctus for a whole, what we call chunks or seasons.
Yeah.
And we'll do it for the first service of the chunk, and we'll look at each other and we're like, we're cutting that to something else next week, because it just didn't work. And so it goes, so then we get to our next value, which is flexibility, which is this is obviously not singable, let's be flexible and do something next week. So we try to be as attentive to the participation as we can.
Sorry to be talking from the back, but we do balance that by also, we're going to do these things over and over and over. So if it's a little wrinkly the first time, we're gonna try again next week.
Sure.
And there's a balance there.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yes.
You were talking about the familiarity and language familiarity. Are all the readings from NRSV or of the Bible, or do you use any other versions?
Do you mind if I speak to that?
Go for it.
So just recently, it's only happened once, typically the readings are from the NRSV, and we have just started to implement readings that are done by heart, or not dramatic readings, but intentionally read readings. And one person who we reached out to who has done this in the past said, do you mind if I use a different translation? What's being said is a little bit difficult. I'm finding it difficult to read, but there's another translation that kind of states in a different way. And so we spoke to our acting associate dean of chapel, and they were like, this is so great. What a wonderful idea. Yeah, go with God. So, and there's also readings in the future where people who are going to be doing this kind of acting out storytelling for the lessons, I think it's going to be very helpful for them to be able to have some creativity to use different language that can help them tell the story in a way that's engaging.
Just a question. I think I know the answer, but did you, for the people serving in the altar party, did they volunteer for this service? I think that really, I'm seeing nods. So that really shows that the people who are participating in the worship in a very formal, official sense are enjoying it. Their body language says they're enjoying it. They're often smiling along or listening. There's a clear opt-in dynamic going on.
Yes.
From acolytes through the deacons and the celebrants that have been officiating. So I think it makes an enormous difference.
Yeah, I do think that is really big. Previous years, this evening service was required. It wasn't opt-in, and so it was really important for us that everybody participating in any way, that it was a choice, and that they wanted to be there, and that the preachers had opted into this vision, even if they didn't know quite what it was, that they were willing to be in conversation about what is this, and how are we doing it, and what is our lens. So thank you. Yeah, that is really important.
And the comment I would make related to that is, and you mentioned this about the preaching particularly, but I feel like I've watched people I know fairly well stretch, try new things, kind of get outside their comfort zone, whether it's preaching or celebrating in a slightly different way. There's just a sense that people are willing to try, and that reminds us, I think, that all of us who are privileged in any kind of leadership in the church, we need to grow and we need to learn. We can get so stuck in the habits of the familiar. And one of the things I find so lovely about the service is how refreshing it is, because we're all being refreshed. There's a sense that it's new and intentional and careful, but that we can risk growing.
Yeah, there have been several preachers that always preach with a manuscript that have tried preaching without notes for the first time in this context. And I was talking with someone who was serving the altar party, and it was his first time serving, and he said, this is my first one. I said, well, what a wonderful service for you to be serving for the first time. But just flipping that from like, oh, you must be so nervous, to I'm so delighted that this is the place where you are doing this for the first time. And just the ways in which we don't assume expertise, and God doesn't assume expertise, and so we can offer all of who we are, and that is enough. We say that a lot. That is enough. This is enough. We have enough. And I think that's a mindset that permeates through. Yeah.
I have a couple related questions. I think early on you referred to this as the community Eucharist. So does that mean it is open to the public?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And there are some community members that do come.
So what happens over the summer when you're not in session, and what happens next year? Because I think you all said you were seniors.
Great questions.
Yeah, it is a seminary worship service, which means that when we're on break, worship takes a break as well. So it won't happen over the summer. But yeah, 5:15 on Thursdays, anyone is welcome to come. Community Eucharist was the old name of it, so rebranded as Thursday Night Live, but it's definitely open to the community. And we have,
Four.
Yes.
We have 4 folks who are taking over.
One of them is here. Her name's Sarah.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful leadership team, and they're coming alongside us for the last 7 weeks of the school to kind of make a transition. But yeah, leadership transitions is an important part wherever your context. We are trying to be really intentional about that. So
Yeah, we took applications and we interviewed, which is not, which is a little bit unusual for how things get passed along here. But we felt like it was within our people are laughing. We felt like that was in our values to really like discern with people whether or not this was the right fit in both directions.
And the same element of opting in. We want new people who are truly invested in the vision of this service, who want to be involved. And thankfully there were
A plethora
of people
And we
that this really speaks to.
We expect it to grow and change too. Like this has been the service that sort of fit the needs of the community this year. And as like this community changes a lot, like every single year. And so we expect that it will look different in the future. And we cannot wait to see sort of the new things that are born.
Sarah, did you have your hand
I was just gonna add a comment to piggyback on the opting in comment. You've been very good about intentionally creating opportunities for involvement. And just for an example, there is a child selected that gets to ring the bell that starts worship. My son, who is 9 and a reluctant churchgoer, saw the bell being rung and all of a sudden wanted to come do that. And so, having small little places where you can opt in as a 9-year-old or an adult has been really important.
That reminds me of the reflection session that we had last week with the youth and the children. Where did you see the living God at work in the worship service? The children were very clear. We see God, the living God at work when we see other people our age participating in leadership in the worship service.
And when we hear the bell.
And I think that was really a big take-home moment for us. It's like, and there's so many other opportunities for us to incorporate youth participation, and we've just scratched the surface. And I think that's definitely an element of the service that I think could definitely change in the future.
I don't know to what extent you have any say or feedback on the timing of the service. So in the context in which I spend my Sundays, there is these days competition with sports. And so, or travel. And so Sundays are not what I think we've all experienced. Sunday mornings are not what Sunday mornings might have been a few generations back. So I don't know what it's been like in your context to have a Thursday evening service and whether you get feedback from some families that, well, can we change the time? Or is this a pretty good time? Because I, in my mind, have this concept of, is this a model that we should look at in other churches where I find in my context, families make it to all their weekday activities, but Sundays are more wishy-washy. So should we have a weeknight intergenerational service that in some ways it's easier for families to plan into? So I'm just sort of curious what your experience has been within the BTS community.
Yes, you should always create more opportunities. No, so the timing is honestly a bit of a challenge. It's a little late for some folks in our community. It's a little early for folks who are commuting. And so that means that we had to make a choice that meant that if you are working away from here, you probably can't make it to this service. And so that's a good example of we're always weighing all of these costs. And decided that it was more important to make it at a time that a 4-year-old could be there than to have a seminary spouse who could go to other services, but that we had to make that call.
We're also constrained by the class schedule as well.
The class schedule.
There are evening classes as well.
I will say from a different context, my field ed parish has a 5 p.m. Saturday evening service, and something I see a lot is people come to that service when there's a swim meet on Sunday morning or when there's a soccer game on Sunday morning. So there are families who rotate through that service who would normally be at church on Sunday morning, but come on Saturday night because it's at 5, you can still do whatever you're doing that night. So I'm in favor of having more different times, knowing that we're probably not going to change the schedule of youth soccer in America. And so I think this is a way for the church to adapt, but
I mean, there have been seasons where, Andrew tries to sign up so-and-so for acolyting and they're like, sorry, we're playing baseball right now. And our go-to has been like to stay in a relationship. Great, we're gonna check back with you next semester and see if you're still playing baseball, or maybe now it's a different season. And is that accurate?
Sure. Yeah, and it's I would say, yeah, every 2 months it changes depending on the different sports. There's a lot of different sports. I had no idea.
I want to save a few minutes to talk about the back of the sheet that we gave you. You'll click one ahead. I'm not going to talk about all of these, but we wrote down some resources that we will commend to you, and just like a couple of sentences about what the resource is. A lot of them come from my particular interest in children and in their inclusion in worship. But you can reach out to Andrew and Elizabeth if you have other specific questions. And then also at the bottom of the page, we wanted to give you some practical ideas from Thursday Night Live, like some very like specific things that we've done and what we've noticed. So I won't go through all of these, but the first one is we've started using Sanctus bells and during the Eucharistic prayer, and we've noticed that people of all ages really love this. And Andrew had a really meaningful experience when he asked a 10-year-old-ish if he wanted to help with the bells. You can tell it better.
Yeah, I said, we're really similar to how we ring the bell at the beginning. We really want to have youth involved with ringing these bells. And I was telling him about what these bells represented, and I said, I was like, when do we ring bells? He's like, well, I was kind of like a dinner bell. Well, when you want to get someone's attention. I was like, that's right. When we ring these bells, we're bringing attention to, we want to bring people's attention. And I'm like, well, what part of the Eucharistic, or what part of communion, or what part of the service do you think you would want to highlight? And the little boy said, well, I think it's really important when we talk about the bread and the wine, specifically taking it in remembrance of me. I said, yes! We ring it when the priest holds up the bread and the priest holds up the wine. That's right. That's so amazing. And I said, what other parts of the service do you think are really important? Well, I think I coached him a little bit, but I said, he was like, well, there's that part where the hands are over the bread and the wine, and the Holy Spirit's involved in some way. I was like, yes, that's right. Ring the bells there too. And then I ultimately talked about, not to get too theological, but I said, I was like, and ultimately we don't really know what happens in the Eucharistic prayer, but after it's all over and we say the big amen, no matter what we believe happens, we know something's changed. And then that's a big important part. And he's like, well, we should ring the bell then too. I was like, yes, we should ring the bell then too. And that's just same curiosity has carried out with other children. And it's a really wonderful moment to have a conversation like why we're doing something that's really been connecting.
So that's an example of how we're trying to infuse formation into this training. Instead of Andrew just like giving him a piece of paper with the Eucharistic prayer and like a mark where he's gonna ring it, he had a conversation to try to help him understand what was going on. And similarly, I was worshiping with a 4-year-old recently and kind of took him up close to see, and I said, oh, they're gonna ring the bells. I wonder what that means. And he said, oh, it's time to pay attention. So this 4-year-old like got it. And so anyway, there's more examples you can read of stuff that we've found, just nuts and bolts stuff that's worked really well.
I think my favorite, this is something I wouldn't have thought about before doing this, but a lot of times people think kids can't do silence. Well, that's not true. Kids can do silence. We have found what works really well, though, is bounding that silence. So maybe ringing a bell at the beginning, having some silence, and then ringing a bell at the end. So it isn't just how long is this lasting, and it helps parents. Again, 2-year-old, I know if I can just hold on for 30 seconds, then, we can be loud again. And so bounding silence with bells or music, I think is another really great takeaway.
One more time. This is our contact information, and I think I put it on the front of this sheet. But we are really excited about this conversation and hoping to take it into 3 new contexts when we graduate in one way or another, but would be happy to be in conversation. And we also wanted to make sure to say that we were not alone in this work. We have sort of been shepherding the work and guiding the work, but as you can see, there's tons of people who have been involved in one way or another, and we're really, really grateful to those folks. And to you for coming and letting us share about this, so thank you.
Thank you all very much for this great